Hello and welcome back to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history, heritage and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Madeline Myhre, and she is talking to us all about stained glass conservation. And when I actually recorded this episode, she was talking to me about pursuing that as a career, and I hope she has succeeded in that goal. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So, Madeline, what is it about stained glass conservation that you want to talk about today?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that I could talk about with stained glass conservation. It's surprisingly a large field. It's like considering how niche it is as a profession. It's a traditional craft that spans over 1,000 years. So, I guess we could always start at kind of its origins. So we could talk about, how it's kind of grown over time. I think a lot of people are unaware just in general about how stained glass works, how it's made. I think a lot of people are aware because they've seen stained glass, especially if you live in the UK. You've seen stained glass in your life. You might not have thought about it a lot. You might have thought that looks really nice, but you hadn't considered what goes into all of that. What's the history and the process of that? And that's essentially what I just spent, 2 years and a lot of money, basically delving and deep diving into, and then writing dissertations and countless papers on. So I'm happy to spread said knowledge and experience with any listeners.
Yeah. Well, the most I know when it comes to stained glass is you often tend to find it in grand places, mostly churches, and it's a bit of a status symbol as well because of the amount of lead that was used to frame the glass and the colouring of the glass of itself. While you've been working with your stained glass conservation, what sort of things have you seen while working with stained glass? Like, can you tell its history by looking at the stained glass itself, like looking at the way the panes were made or anything like that?
Yeah. So basically, and this comes into play with pretty much all architectural history. So if you know enough about a specific envelope, you can actually read it. So you can read roughly when it's been built. You can read what's happened to it over time and how for a while, I think I used to call that ghosts. I said you can see and you can read and interpret the ghosts on the facade. And not all of that is natural. Not all of that is naturally done. Some of that is by warfare. Some of that is by graffiti. And some of it is going to be by intervention of improper conservation over time as well. So with glass, stained glass, you have the same thing, but it's pretty complex because as a medium, stained glass is constantly breaking. It's susceptible to a lot of movement, to change, to weathering. It's unique because what makes stained glass so interesting as an art form is it's monumental. It's a mixture of paint. I mean, you could call it in itself an art form that is unique outside of any other kind of painted form. But it's this giant kind of monumental painting, but at the same time, it acts as part of the envelope to the building where it has to insulate. So it's utilitarian as well as it also is artistic. And so because of that, it's hard to classify exactly where it fits. But anyways, the point being is it's exposed to the elements a lot, and therefore humidity, water, storms, debris, intentional vandalism, all is something that's changed it. So in that, say you have some medieval glass in a church, maybe it's 700, 800 years old, chances are it's been repaired hundreds and hundreds of times over the years. And there's probably very little original makeup of that. Not the actual material. There's probably a lot of original material, but they've probably changed where it was originally. They've changed the shape, the space. They didn't have the skills maybe to patch it. Instead, they decided to change things around and added different leads. So it's changed a lot. And most of the time when you're looking at stained glass, it's a mess. It's an absolute puzzle And it's going to take hours upon hours and hours just to decipher how a small section of it may have originally been. So the complications of legibility is a serious thing that is dealt with in this profession. And the people who view it oftentimes have problems connecting with it these days because it's lost its legibility over time. So they look at it, they see fragmentary pieces of glass as far as the eye can see, and they can no longer understand what it's supposed to depict. Therefore, it's not doing the purpose of actually being able to be engaged with from the masses, other than someone saying, wow, that's a really big piece of beautiful fragmented colored glass. Um, so there's those complications, but you can, if you know glass enough, you should be able to look at it and you should be able to say, I think it comes relatively from this time period. So this is after you've studied enough. And you can look at it and you can start reading the fabric of it and say, okay, I can see repairs here, 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 here. I can see that this person, it's cracked, the face has been missing, they've redone the face at a later time. And those are the type of skills that you kind of pick up, but it's going to take hundreds of hours of documentation and analysis to fully give that kind of report and understanding of it.
Mm. And roughly, so being able to tell from like what period it's from, what kind of telltale signs would say that it's come from the Tudor era or something? What would be the telltale signs for you to then know it came from that era, roughly?
So basically you have separate periods of stained glass kind of evolution, and they're actually not as there's very few periods, so they go for long spans of time, so it's easy to kind of explain how that worked. But in the medieval time period, so the beginning of glass, for example, you have basically glass. This is an experimental time because these are the first people producing this type of art in this way. It's never been done before, and it's highly organized by Christianity and the need to embark light in the space, and this mission to have all this light based on the book of Genesis, let there be light, let this kind of illuminate the space. And so it's said that it was Christianity that directly birthed this kind of art, though there's a lot of evidence to suggest that stained glass was already evolved in other religions and other cultures before, long before, hundreds of years before they were using it in the church. We just don't have exact examples to be able to show that. But possibly they are definitely, I wouldn't say possibly, I would say that they're definitely the first ones to combine colored glass and these painted methods that we're talking about now. But for example, the ancient Egyptians had been using fused glass for 1,000 years before that. So any case, the medieval, they're experimenting. They're working with an art form that nobody's worked with to the extent that they're doing. And a lot of that just, well, we can look at it today and say, this is chemistry. This is interesting and in-depth levels of chemistry. It's to them alchemy, so they're looking at it and they're saying, I combine poof and I get beautiful color, and I'll do it again, and I'll do it in separate other ways, and I'll do it 1,000 times until I get other beautiful color. And so they're just having a bunch of fun things, mixing things around and then observing it for long periods of time. But in the things that they're able to do, they're able to make some of the purest examples of colored glass that we've ever seen. And this is just through experimentation alone. And later on, to kind of move this forward a little bit, and I'll go back and explain, in the Gothic revival movement, so the Victorians, and we've got the 19th century, they are part of this movement, and they are desperately trying to rebirth the medieval styles of stained glass. But so much so because the technology and the knowledge behind that had been lost for hundreds of years. So they're trying to bring it all back, but they, for the life of them, cannot understand how they've been able to produce such superior quality of glass without industrial methods. And the Victorians have something they didn't, which is industrial processing and chemicals that they didn't, and an understanding of chemistry that they didn't. And so when you look at that, you should say, oh, well, they should be able to reproduce that easily. Yet they spend years doing their own kind of experimental processes where they're saying, okay, this is going to create, if I add this and that, it's going to create an even more vivid green, and I can work with this. And I can work with this. But they also have quotas, and they have to produce for materiality and different clients and deadlines that they weren't doing in, let's say, the 13th century and the 14th century. And so they're trying to make things more efficient as well. So they're adding elements that didn't exist before. So a lot of times when people could make mistakes, they could look at a piece of Victorian Gothic Revival glass and think that it is a medieval piece of glass, but there will be telltale signs. And some of those signs would include the fact that Victorians could not figure out their paint. They could not figure out how to get the paint to fuse in proper ways. Now, some Victorian glass is done very well, but it is notorious, infamous in the stained glass conservation community for having horrible paint degradation over time. And that is because they were trying to improve the amount of time or cut back on costs for baking large quantities of glass. So they're saying, I've got all this enamels that need to be baked. I have a lot of stain, of actual stain, and maybe paint. All of those possibly need to be fired at different temperatures. And that requires a lot of energy, a lot of coals, a lot of heat to be able to do, and not to mention 3 separate amounts of time, which is going to expand their budget. So they're saying, okay, if we want to cut costs, we want to do this all, we need something that's going to make them all cook, kind of bake at the same time for longer or shorter processes. And their solution was adding something called borax to it. And that's what we call the borax problem today, because the borax was supposed to make it so they could cook at lower temperatures longer and keep them all kind of sustained. And it seemed to work at first, but after 2 years, 3 years, the paint all started coming off. I mean, this was in their time period. They had to go several reports of stained glass professionals that had to go redo windows in their own time, not to mention what they've done over 150 years. Most of them, you can't make out any type of idea what the picture used to be. It's a mixture of not just the borax, but it seems that they also weren't mixing paint properly. So the paint that is actually comprised on stained glass is comprised up of, I like to kind of make people aware of the fact that it's not, how do I describe this? It's not really paint, it's glass. You're painting with glass. So what you're doing is you're taking glass and then you take more glass and you powder it until it's almost like sand again. You powder it down, and then you add oxides to it, metal oxides that would be your pigment. And then once you've got those mixed together, you add an oil that's going to make it easier to apply with a brush with traditional painting methods. So usually use clove or lavender. And when it gets applied onto that piece and then you bake it, it's actually going to melt and fire that glass and pigment directly back into the glass and then recreating the glass process. So it is not sitting on top of the glass. It is now a new layer of the glass itself. So yeah, you're painting with glass essentially. And when you're painting with that, you have to keep a mask on at all times because you would literally be breathing in glass particles. It's not great for your lungs. But the point being is that the Victorians, they had 2 different processes where it seemed that they hadn't figured that out. And that was because they did not have a proper understanding of what they were doing in the medieval time period. But we have documentation and understanding to what's going on to great extent from the very popular and studied Theophilus, who is a monk and, a scholar in the all the way back, we're talking about the 13th century. And it's 12th century, late 12th century. So Theophilus is writing in the 12th century as a monk, basically observing different people's art forms. And that's his whole job. He goes around to different artists in art forms and he writes about what they do in detail. It seems that and it's called like basically on the treatise of art. Or on diverse arts. And he seems to write the most about metalworking, which has made people think that possibly he was a metal worker because it's way too in detailed and way too in depth to think otherwise.
Yeah.
And Theophilus, he writes for the first time about stained glass and its production, and he writes about how they make the colors, and he writes about the crucibles that they do, and he writes about he makes a diagram in this and explains how to build a furnace, how to build a stained glass furnace, how to keep it going, how to mix the paints,
So the book was there, and yet the Victorians still didn't know what to do in regards to
Well,
making stained glass?
I think they were looking at it and they're saying this is how we make stained glass. But at the same time, they thought that they could improve the methods through industrial production, and we can see that that did not exactly go as planned. There was also instances where they just couldn't, even given textual sources, they could not figure out how to produce certain colors. Um,
Mm.
they wanted this beautiful purple color, for example, which is used as a magnesium. It's difficult. It's difficult to create, and every single time it was coming out this kind of magenta or like bright kind of pink, and their colors, their glass was more transparent as well instead of being more opaque because it was thinner. Um, People didn't
Mm.
like it. You know, they had instances where a church would hire a Victorian artist to produce a new stained glass window for them to match other Gothic windows they had, and they wanted it to be the same style. And the Victorians, they did their damnedest, and then they put it in, and the congregation, the committee hated it because it was too bright, it was too translucent, and there's a lot of factors going into that, especially the fact that the old glass is dirty, the old glass is deteriorated, the old glass is more opaque, and that the old glass had
Mm.
production styles that we quite frankly don't know how that they did some of it. And so the Victorians had to do workarounds to make their glass look more like the original glass. They start applying shades. So they start painting black on the outside of the glass to darken the color and the consistency and the opaqueness from the inside. They start applying, this is one of my favorite parts of the Gothic revival. They start doing basically fake dirt and aging practices to make it look like it's basically theater stage production, right? So
Mm.
they're painting black basically around the lead lines so it looks like lead deterioration and dirt. You know, they're doing splatter paint, they're doing all this sort of stuff to make it look like it's faux aged, basically to fit in with the other stuff. It's like a Disney, you know, level of type of work that they're doing, and it's fascinating. So trying to, as a professional, look at that type of glass from a just from a glance, the first glance, that can be hard, especially when
Mm.
they're trying so hard to convince you that that is old glass. Um, and I can't tell you that I'm already trained well enough to not make that mistake over and over again, especially when they deteriorate so badly and can look like they're as bad as 800-year-old glass.
Mm.
But it's something, especially in the ways that you see the glass itself and the consistency that you can kind of pick up over time. But basically, after the Gothic period, you have a substantial amount of time where stained glass, the creation of it, the understanding of it is basically lost.
Mm.
You know, and that's particularly thought to be due to the bubonic plague. It's thought to do because of vast amounts of death that happened at that time. Now, we also know that it bounces back after that as well, especially in the late medieval time period. And we know that people are producing glass like never before. For example, in York Minster,
Yeah.
the east window of York Minster was done after the bubonic plague. But I wrote a paper on the effects of plague on the workforce in on stained glass and how that really kind of came into play. And it's hard because there's not a ton of written evidence to suggest, but it sounds like um, the effects weren't necessarily there weren't enough people to work in it. In fact, it sounds like the people that survived. Can you hear me?
Mm. Yeah.
Okay. It sounds like the people who survived the plague, the ones that were lucky enough to do so, it sounds like business for them ended up quadrupling. Um,
Yeah, I've heard that before, where because there were so few people, they could then go, "Oh well, I'm the only one." So,
Look at me. Yeah, I mean, they become high demand, and so we start seeing people that might have been looked over in the past now have chances that they wouldn't have had before by luck of nature that they survived it. You know,
mm.
and that's basically how Thornton, how these people in York Minster get these commissions, and also through political advances as well. You know, and knowing the right people, but still, you know, the point is that after all of this, it does enter at least by the 17th century. It
Mm.
enters kind of this dark age time. Um,
Mm.
where it's just not being produced in the same way again. And you have artists who, once again, want to start experimenting a little bit. And
yeah, I suppose that's the one good thing about churches anyway, that you can do that sort of stuff. Like you get the stonemasons as well; they're all experimenting in their own thing. Again, like the standard thing of being a stonemason is obviously to help with the structure of a building or whatever. But when you're making like the gargoyles and things, I think there's another term for the different sort of gargoyles you have. But that's the area where they're able to experiment. And
yeah,
I suppose with each new generation, people want to do their own thing and leave their own mark. So that's not
yeah,
surprising that experimentation was happening.
yeah, and especially with technological advances, and that's what we're kind of pushing with the Victorians here, right?
Mm,
As soon as they have different technology, they want to try to kind of maximize this. And in the 17th century, especially, this is going to be with enamels. And this goes
mm,
on in the 18th century too. So as enamels become more widespread use, especially in Flemish glass in the Netherlands, um, excuse me, people want to start working with it more often on glass. And enamels on glass are a little more complex than the paint, which becomes a substrate of the glass. But enamels tend to sit on top of the glass almost as an outside layer, which, it has its problems because it is more susceptible to chipping and water damage over time. And so when we look at enameled glass, you can definitely tell right away that it's enameled. One, because it looks separate, it looks different. It's really opaque, um,
mm,
and it doesn't have the same quality and consistency that you see in paint or in stain, which are two separate things, by the way. Stain is usually made out of silver nitrate, and it quite literally stains the glass. Where paint, this glass paint, becomes the glass itself.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so when we're saying stained glass, we actually literally mean, if you're thinking about the stained, it would be silver nitrate. This type of, or these other type of oxides, type of nitrates that could be applied. But painted glass is what we're typically referring to. And of course, there's non-painted glasses as well, especially coming into the 19th century and the 20th century, that mosaic forms that become absolutely gorgeous. But none of that aside, when enamel becomes popular in glass, it changes the way that people start working with. And I think this is also just the lack of knowledge about the lead work and being able to work in
mm,
this. It becomes easier for these traditionally trained painters to paint as they would a canvas, the stained glass. So they start to ignore these traditional principles. They're not getting trained by these masters, and they start treating glass just like it is simply a canvas that glows in the light.
mm,
Um, so they stop using lead, and they start just creating small panels and then painting a panel. Like, think that you're making a giant painting, and each small panel is a different quadrant of that painting. And this was really, really popular even before, I should say, even before this is going to really become popular, when the enamels, but they were doing this early on too. But the pre-Raphaelites, they're going to really, really push this too.
mm,
Um, and it has a huge counter movement, especially today, and especially in the Gothic revival period too, because people who wanted to revive this craft saw that they were just destroying the traditional need. And still today, people will make stained glass this way. And then you'll have these traditionalists in the communities that really push back against people doing this, because they think that it's an oversimplification of the process. And they think that if you wanted to paint a vision that way, if you wanted to paint an art piece, then why just go and use your own other medium, because it doesn't do justice to the actual glass. You can't really appreciate it in the same way, and it certainly doesn't have the movement that you need. Um, so there's still a lot of strong thoughts about this. I was at a conference in August in Michigan. It was a stained glass conference, and these are American glass artists, and a lot of them, they had these beautiful depictions of their art, and some of them used intricate leads, and some of them didn't. Some of them used entire fused glass pieces. Some of them just painted glass. They all were using their own techniques. And the person who judged it said that in his definition, glass is comprised of lead that is separated between pieces, that shows complexity, movement, and depth, and then contributes to 1,000 years of tradition and culture. And if it is not, then it is simply not stained glass. And so he was judging it based on those criteria, and therefore gave the award of the best kind of work to someone who was actually doing traditional types of work. But that's just another one of those movements where you could pick up quite quickly when that time period came from, because they're not utilizing stained glass in the same way. They're not utilizing the paint in the same way, and that's a change of how everything's going on. Go on.
Yeah. So when it comes to the colouring of the glass and stuff, is this the reason why, like, say, Mary is wearing blue, for example? Is it because that was easier to make or something?
Well, Mary wearing blue is just that's biblical, So she's the Virgin Mary, and today we use white as a symbol of purity. But when the Bible and everything was, when we're talking about this, everything was being created, blue was the sign of purity.
Ah.
So she is blue because this is her innocence and her purity, and therefore the Virgin Mary blue is one of the most noticeable types of blue in these types of works. I don't think blue is one of the more complicated colors to make. I think the vividness of the blue can be really complicated, especially if you want to get something that's like, like a cobalt or something that is really deep indigo that can be complex, but greens have always been difficult. Reds, some of the most difficult, and reds are still today the most expensive colors to buy. And in fact, they were always so expensive that people, especially later on, start to produce methods in which it's called flash glass. And with flash glass, only the top little layer is red. So the top layer is red and the bottom layer is red. But if you're to cut that glass in half and you look in between, it will be clear. So clear and then red on the top. It's called flash glass. It's how a lot of people can afford large quantities of red glass even today.
So you've already mentioned York Minster as a good place for stained glass, and I know that it's got a lot of lovely details, not just the glass in itself, but there's some other interesting things as well. So I know, I don't know if you can still see it today, but there was a little exhibition talking about graffiti that was in the glass, of like people leaving their marks when they put it in. But I think the one that's the most noticeable is there's a window they have, and it's all black now. Pretty much, it's like super dark because of what they did in the 1940s. As a conservator, I'm assuming that's also things that are causing issues as well, not just the Victorians, but other time periods trying to protect this stuff.
Yeah. So it's a good point, because after the Victorians, the next big thing, the next shift in glass that you'll see is going to be the next experimental method. And that is what we call post-war glass. So this is going to be post-World War II specifically. It can be post-World War I. Essentially, it's when we have a brand new set of technology, and that is around plastics, new technology, plastics, things that we can implement. And they're using technology that they've learned in the war as well. Now, some of this is technology to prevent harm to the glass during bombings. And some of it is to fix the glass. Most of it is to fix the glass after the bombings or the problems that have occurred. And then there's another phase of having to replace when there's nothing left. And one of my friends in my program, her entire focus, and still is today, her dissertation, her undergrad, has been on German post-war glass in Naumburg Cathedral, and what that's like, how that's kind of emphasized, because they had nothing, all their glass was gone. And so instead of trying to recreate that, they decided to embrace the end of this tradition, to embrace the end and the entrance into a modern time after so much decimation and after so much heartbreak. And so they basically commissioned these new modern methods of stained glass that nobody had seen before. And this is definitely hyper industrialism mixed with different types of plastics, resins, and materials they're able to use. This gives birth to a type of glass starting in the 40s, but really popular in the 60s, called dalle de verre glass. And dalle de verre glass is basically giant like you can think of them like concrete blocks, because they can be 6-8 inches thick. And if you made a big concrete block of colored glass and then took a pickaxe and started cutting it up into little pieces and then arranging them in a platform and then pouring concrete in between it instead of lead, instead of all that. That's how you get Dal de Verre glass. It is so heavy, so interesting, so varied and complex, yet it is impossible to conserve because it, for one panel to take out Dal de Verre is 2 tons. You'd have to have a lifted out. It's I mean, I had one of my professors he's a professional just in Dal de Verre glass, and he did like experimental conservation method on a wall on one of these old churches just to see how much it would cost. And I think they said like just to conserve, the entirety of this Dal de Verre glass would be, you know, millions, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And I mean,
Jesus.
this is only from the 1960s.
Yeah.
So it's less than 100 years old. And this is not glass that can consistently stay. This is not an art form that is meant to last. So that brings a whole bunch of other ethical implications for conservators. But the point is that most of the glass that we're seeing moving, if it's not Dal de Verre, the creation of new modernist glass, which is what we call, you have the problems like you're mentioning in York Minster and some of these places, which is ill-informed conservation practices using methods that have not been tried, true, or practiced. And that's because the actual act of conservation, of preservation in general, is relatively new. I mean, it's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, but the actual formalized method with, data and empirical reasoning behind it is still very new since after mostly the world wars, and so they didn't know any better because there wasn't any other examples to kind of base everything off of. Some of the things were best intent. Some of them, classic example is they had these methods. There's a method called the Jacobian method, which is where you sandwich, let's say you had a piece of glass that was broken in 4 or 5 separate ways. It's a beautiful piece of glass, but you don't want to ruin it by putting leads in all those different places and ruining the look of that glass like we've seen so much over time. Well, that's okay because we have these new methods, we have these new resins and glues that are cleared, and what we can do is we can take 2 clear pieces of glass and we can put those arranged fragments together nicely, and then we're going to just completely saturate it in this, basically polyresin plastic, basically, and then sandwich them in between these 2 clear glasses, and then insulate the edges of that. And now we have this amazing, beautiful piece of glass that is unbroken. The problem behind all of this is that material did not age well. It starts yellowing, not to mention sealing off a glass in general like this created a really problematic vacuum seal with water that got stuck in there. And then it was completely irreversible. So one of the core principles of conservation is it needs to be reversible, and none of this was reversible. And the Jacobian method nobody uses it anymore. It's an outlawed method in conservation, but it was one of those things in the 40s that was becoming popular because of technologies that have been used on airplanes in the war. Insulative measures that they thought would fix glass or keep glass more protected ended up harming glass even more than before. So, you're right. Some of the most detrimental processes for glass today have been in the last 100 years.
So I know this is going to be a bit of a hard question. I'm assuming that you've seen loads of different styles of stained glass throughout your travels and stuff like that. Yeah. So if you were going to do a timeline of stuff stained glass from, say, from churches you've visited, which ones would you say represent those different stages of stained glass being developed? This might be a really big question.
Yeah, I think that you'll surprisingly find a lot of those instances in areas that are the most war torn.
Okay.
So you'll find a lot of these examples in France. You'll find a lot of these examples in Germany. And that's because they did have bombings. Even here in the UK as well. And they had bombings, but maybe they didn't lose everything. So, what you'll end up finding, because maybe there was already Victorian involvement in the church, there usually is, there was a lot of money at that time. What you'll end up having is you'll have original, maybe medieval stained glass, you'll have Victorian glass, and you'll have these modern implements all together in one envelope that are kind of contrasting, merging, meeting. Um, you have instances where conservators have to make plans on what windows are going to be prioritized in conservation methods if they're so expensive. And they prioritize them based on original materiality, design, and by the notable aspects of those artists as well. And usually the Victorian glass gets put on the wayside, and especially modern glass as well would be the first to go. Um, but that glasses, all of those glass have their own places and their own movements and their own conservation methods and ethics. And so they all have their own validity. So there's that fallacy that we have in any profession, whether it be archaeology or conservation or history, where we tend to think the older something is, the more validity it had. Or if you're specifically a specialist in one area, you might make that mistake. And so much of conservation and preservation is made up of people deciding that one area is less valid and destroying something that another generation is going to really appreciate. And it's hard to determine where to draw those lines and to understand those things. Because today, the mid-century modern, 1960s building materials are really, really popular, and people love those types of houses. But when I was growing up, just even in the early 2000s, I hated those houses. They reminded me of, people's stuffy grandparents' houses that had shag carpet and smelled like 40 years of stale cigarettes, like they weren't attractive to me. And now there's a huge movement where there's a revival and they're beautiful, but it shows you just in my time how much those have changed and people have appreciated that craft. And the same things in stained glass as well, where we tend to think medieval glass is the penultimate, that's going to be the best glass. And if you're a stained glass conservator, you obviously want to work with medieval glass. And I'm not even really interested in medieval glass that much. I think it's cool. I like the originals. You can't get wrong with the OG, but there's something beautiful, more beautiful than the start of a movement, I think, is the beauty of someone, the futile beauty of someone trying to emulate it hundreds of years later. I think that the Gothic revival period will always be my favorite time, because they didn't see themselves as revivalists. They saw themselves as active participants in a movement that had been dead 600 years before them, or 400 years before them, however much you want to classify technically that was. The point was that it had been many generations since, and they saw themselves not as revivalists, but as Gothic people themselves. And they were just employing different technology in that. But at the same time, they have classified themselves so separately. I think there's definitely a beauty, and we see it in the Renaissance as well, and people trying to rebirth things that they feel have been lost, but they haven't. Those aspects have always kept around. Um, so yeah, answering your question all the way in the beginning, there's lots of different cathedrals that you can see those implementations of different time periods all throughout. I wouldn't say, like, for example, if you were someone who's based in York, York Minster has the largest expanse of original medieval glass in the world. So it makes it so amazing. It's why we study here. Yeah, and that's because, excuse me, it's because so much medieval glass was destroyed during the Reformation. And that's where a lot of this art was actually lost, was during the Reformation as well. Not just the art, but the skill to make that art as well. So much of the Protestant Reformation was defiling and destroying old saints and their depictions and the things behind it. It's all been changed and lost. And so to have so much original medieval glass, like you see in York Minster, is unusual. But you don't get any of that modernist involvement because it was spared, it was saved majorly during World War II.
Yeah.
So that all being said, you won't see those same influences that you might see in some of the other churches that were more heavily impacted as well. But you might have luck with more of those type of conglomerate additions of time in some of the smaller parish churches as well, all around the place.
So while you've been working with conservation, what's your favourite part about working with the stained glass? Is it seeing the history, or is it because it's like a puzzle or some? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the puzzles maybe less for me just because I think puzzles in general require a great deal of logic. I feel like I kind of rebel against those logic. But then I found out that I actually love puzzles over time. I just don't like the classic jigsaw puzzles. But stained glass does become suddenly jigsaw puzzles on steroids, on crack. And I don't know if I love that. Um, but I would say what I love about working as a conservator in stained glass is I love basically getting to handle and see hundreds of years of human involvement and being able to connect with those artists and understand, because even though I might not be trying to put my mark, I'm trying to respect and keep this glass in its state as it is. I'm not trying to change, I'm not trying to restore, put my little flourish on it. But I get to somehow participate in a way that is respectful to the original artist, to try to envision and understand what they might have been trying to employ originally. um, and I think that that is probably my favorite part, is kind of walking in their little footsteps in the back. And it's like sleuthing, it's like sleuthing, but I feel like I'm engaging with them in certain ways. I'd like to think that they would be happy that someone is working as hard as where that there's a profession dedicated just to keeping up their art. I think that they would be happy about that. But I think there's so much complex part of this field that is so daunting as well. And some of those complexities are engaged in the actual artistry that's involved too. And more than anything, it's the ethical quandaries. The ethical considerations behind conservation are some of the most frustrating and dismal for me, because I feel like you can talk yourselves in a circle for an hour, an hour, an hour, and just keep on going. And at the end of it, you've decided, well, I've considered every ethical consideration for this, and I will do nothing, because too much of this is considered. If I do this, if I do this, if I do this, I'll be doing this. And by the end of it, you just say, oh well, we're going to do the most minimally invasive thing possible.
Yeah.
Nothing. And at that point I feel like, why are we even here? Why are we even making these decisions? Why are we doing things in the first place if we're going to be this ridiculous about our thought process? It's almost like there's a philosophical school where people are just tormenting themselves about being the ones to ruin this thing that's been untouched for so many years. And there's a lot of weight behind that, because guess what? Other academics, they're going to see your work someday. Other conservators, they're going to peer review your work, and they're probably going to they're not going to be happy. No one's ever happy about the work that you do, because they want to be as minimally invasive as possible. But in some ways, you can't always do that. There's a lot of considerations to be made, and not all of it is you get infinite amounts of funding and you get to just sit there and play around and do whatever you want. It's you have clients, they've got budgets, they've got timelines, and they want you to do something that you might not want to do. And those are all the realities and considerations that make this field a lot harder. But I would say, just to finish answering that question, that is what I love outside of the complications and the things that make things so difficult. The things I love are basically getting to touch and see and interact with material that people usually don't get to do. That's my favorite part.
Yeah. I can relate to that. Like, because I'm from an archaeological background, and it's the same kind of feel that just being in a dig and being able to handle this thing that people haven't seen in for however long, it's just
Yeah.
it just connects to you on a human level of going, this was done with someone's hands, and now it's in mine, and it's just, yeah,
Yeah, like the last person who held this, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago, it hasn't been touched until that person, and now I'm connecting with it all over time. It can be really special, and that's how I feel the same way with the stained glass as well. The
yeah.
last person to have put this lead, the last person to remove this piece of glass from this lead, was, you know, a man in a dusty apron in a studio, in 1427, and they never would have considered that this is the person interacting with this all of those years later. I mean, that's a fascinating part of it. It's like you get to reach across time, you know?
Yeah. Oh, well, this has been really wonderful. So thank you for all that. You clearly are very passionate about this profession and stuff. And I do wish you I wish you a lot of luck and being able to go further with this as well. Because it sounds like a really rewarding path you're going down. Is there anything else you want to talk about before we sign off?
No, I think that was really fun to be able to talk to you. I always like talking to people about stained glass. I'm starting basically at a studio in Cambridge at the end of November. So I've been offered a job there, so I'll be starting as a conservator. And in Cambridge, I'll get the opportunity to work with a lot of different types of glass. But in that area, I'll probably get more opportunities with medieval glass than I would in other parts of the country. So it's very exciting.
Yeah. Oh, well, good luck to you there.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. It was great talking to you, Kaylee.
It's been great talking to you as well. So, what would you recommend to anybody who wants to go down this profession themselves?
Well, you can do a lot of self-study before you have to even go into the academic realms. If you're interested in the practical pursuits of it, you can also definitely become an apprentice or actually study in a studio without having to take the academic credentials. But if you're interested in the architectural history and all of this context that I've talked about today, that's something that you can certainly pursue on an academic perspective. Now, as far as the field is concerned, is for a master's program. This is in at the University of York is the only program in the world that's taught in English. So you can study it in Italy, you can study it in Spain and other places, but this will be the only one that you can actually learn about it in English, especially with the amount of original material that we have in York Minster. So if you want to go down that route and you really are interested in understanding it from the art history, from the background of all of that, and help that inform your profession as you go along, this would definitely be the program to do it in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Madeline, for being on this podcast and for sharing all this wonderful wisdom. I'm going to be looking at stained glass in a completely different light now after this. So thank you so much for this.
You're welcome. I hope you have a great night.